The packed courtroom in Boston, Massachusetts, was silent. Rows of people filled every seat, their eyes locked on the small figure standing in the center of the room. The tension was thick, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Jamal Harris, just 10 years old, stood with his hands clenched at his sides. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he refused to let his fear show. He had come too far to back down now. The room felt massive, the walls towering around him, but he forced himself to stand tall. Opposite him, Judge Victoria Langley sat high above the courtroom, her sharp gaze locked onto him. She was a well-known hardliner, feared by many, respected by few. Even now, with her pregnant belly barely concealed beneath her robe, her presence radiated authority. There was no sign of warmth or patience in her expression. She leaned forward slightly, her expression cold. "You think you're better than everyone, huh?" Her voice cut through the silence like a knife, laced with skepticism. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Attorneys exchanged glances. Spectators shifted in their seats. No one dared to speak. The weight of the judge's words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Jamal inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He could feel the weight of countless eyes watching, waiting to see what he would do next. The pressure was suffocating, but he had no choice but to face it head-on. He had been underestimated before, dismissed as just another kid from the wrong side of town. But today, he wasn't going to let that define him. The judge's gavel rested within her grasp. Her fingers curled tightly around the handle. The tension between them was palpable. The room was waiting, the silence stretching on. Jamal's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel sweat forming at the back of his neck, but he held his ground. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, but he refused to let them shake. The attorneys, sitting at their respective tables, whispered among themselves. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward, their pens poised over their notepads. The jury, though silent, watched with curiosity. Jamal could hear the faint clicking of a camera somewhere in the back of the courtroom. Every move he made, every breath he took, was being recorded, scrutinized. Judge Langley's lips pressed into a thin line as she waited for his response. The intensity of her stare didn't waver, and Jamal knew this was a test. The question she had asked wasn't just about him. It was about the case, about everything that had led him here. This was it. This was his moment. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself. He knew the truth. He knew why he was here. And he knew that no matter how much the judge doubted him, he had to stand firm. When justice is tested, will truth prevail? One boy's courage is about to change everything. Have you ever been underestimated but proved people wrong? Let's talk. Just 24 hours earlier, Jamal Harris was walking home, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the chilly Boston air nipping at his face. The street was quiet, only the occasional honk of a distant car breaking the silence. He had taken this route hundreds of times before, but tonight felt different. Something in the air, in the way the streetlights flickered, made his steps slow. Then he heard it. The screech of tires, the unmistakable sound of rubber skidding against asphalt. He turned his head just in time to see an SUV careening out of control, its headlights cutting jagged patterns through the darkness. His heart pounded as the vehicle spun wildly before slamming into a street pole with a deafening crash. Jamal stood frozen for half a second before his feet moved on their own. The crumpled hood of the SUV hissed, steam rising from beneath it. He could hear the sputtering engine, the faint smell of gasoline thick in the air. Someone was inside. He rushed forward, his pulse roaring in his ears. Through the shattered window, he saw a woman slumped over the steering wheel, her breathing shallow. The streetlight overhead illuminated her face, and recognition struck him like a bolt of lightning. Judge Victoria Langley. His breath caught. The same Judge Langley who ruled her courtroom like an iron fortress. The same woman who had dismissed people like him without a second thought. But none of that mattered now. She was trapped, and the car was leaking fuel. Jamal yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on the window. "You have to get out! The car's leaking fuel," he shouted. Langley stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, cradling it as panic flashed across her face. "My baby," she whispered, her voice weak. Jamal didn't hesitate. He braced his foot against the side of the SUV and pulled with all his strength. Metal groaned, the door inching open just enough for him to squeeze his hands through. "Come on, you have to move," he urged. With trembling limbs, Langley tried to push herself up. Jamal reached inside, gripping her arm, using every ounce of strength he had to haul her out of the wreckage. She staggered, unsteady, leaning on him as he pulled her to safety. And then the SUV erupted in flames. A blast of heat surged behind them, sending Jamal and Langley stumbling forward. The fire roared, swallowing the vehicle whole. He shielded his face, his heart hammering as the reality of how close they had come sank in. Langley clutched her stomach, her breaths coming in uneven gasps. "Would you have risked your life to save someone who might not respect you? Let's discuss." Jamal Harris stood on the pavement, his chest still rising and falling from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The fire from the SUV crackled behind him, black smoke billowing into the cold night air. He had just saved Judge Victoria Langley and her unborn child from certain death. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt fear. Sirens blared in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights flickered against the nearby buildings as 2 police cruisers skidded to a stop. The moment the officers stepped out, hands hovering over their holsters, Jamal knew something was wrong. Before he could explain, a voice rang out from the crowd of bystanders. "That boy was near the car before it crashed." Jamal whipped his head around, eyes wide. A man pointed straight at him, his expression twisted with suspicion. Others in the crowd murmured in agreement, nodding as if the accusation made perfect sense. Officer Reynolds, a tall man with a hardened expression, approached. "What were you doing here, kid?" Jamal's pulse pounded. "I saved her. The car crashed and I pulled her out before it exploded. Ask her." Reynolds didn't let go of his arm. "We'll sort this out at the station." "No," Jamal protested, his voice cracking. "I didn't do anything wrong." But Judge Langley, still dazed from the accident, remained silent. Her lack of defense sealed his fate. Another officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The cold metal snapped around Jamal's wrists before he could protest again. The crowd's murmurs turned into whispers. Some shook their heads, while others simply watched. He scanned the faces, searching for anyone who would stand up for him. But the bystanders remained passive, unwilling to get involved. Jamal swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He turned his head toward Langley, willing her to speak, to tell them the truth. But she was still clutching her stomach, eyes unfocused, lost in shock. Whether she realized what was happening or not, she didn't stop them. Reynolds guided Jamal toward the squad car, his grip firm. "You can explain yourself at the station." Jamal tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, I saved her." His words fell on deaf ears. The car door opened, and Jamal was pushed inside. The door slammed shut, the sound final, like a cell door locking him away from the world. Through the window, he could still see the wreckage, the flickering flames, the people watching from a distance. He wanted to scream to force them to see the truth. Instead, he clenched his fists, pressing them into his lap, his wrists aching against the cuffs. He had risked everything to save a life, and now he was being treated like a criminal. The engine rumbled to life, and the car pulled away, the flashing lights reflecting off the glass. He didn't know what awaited him at the station, but one thing was clear. Justice wasn't blind. Do you think the system automatically assumes the worst about certain people? Let's discuss. Jamal Harris stood in the middle of the courtroom, his heart pounding, but his stance unwavering. The weight of every eye in the room pressed against him, but he refused to look away. Across from him, Judge Victoria Langley sat high on the bench, her expression unreadable. The same woman whose life he had saved now had the power to decide his fate. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jamal said, his voice steady. "I saved you." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The tension was thick, the air charged with anticipation. Langley studied him for a long moment, her fingers lightly tapping against the bench. "Do you have proof you didn't cause the accident?" she asked. Gasps filled the room. Even now, she doubted him. Jamal clenched his fists, fighting back frustration. He had risked his life, yet he was the one standing trial, the one forced to prove his innocence. He turned toward his attorney, who nodded and stepped forward. "Your Honor, the street cameras recorded everything. The footage proves that Jamal didn't cause the crash. He saved you." Judge Langley blinked, her composed expression faltering for the first time. The tension in the room shifted as the prosecution exchanged uncertain glances. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. "Play the footage," she ordered. The courtroom hushed as a screen flickered to life. The grainy surveillance video played, capturing every second of what had happened that night. The SUV spinning out of control, the violent crash. And then, Jamal running toward the wreck, pulling Langley from the burning vehicle. The room was silent as the video ended. All eyes turned to the judge. Langley's face had gone pale. She sat back in her chair, fingers gripping the armrests. She exhaled slowly, as if the weight of the truth had finally settled upon her shoulders. Jamal didn't look away. He had spent the last 24 hours fighting to be heard, to be seen for who he truly was, not the suspect they assumed him to be, but the hero he had proven himself to be. Have you ever had to prove your innocence, despite doing the right thing? Share your experience. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the video began to play. Every eye in the room remained glued to the screen, watching the events unfold in real time. The grainy footage captured the SUV spinning out of control, slamming into the street pole. Then, a small figure appeared, Jamal Harris. The entire courtroom watched as he sprinted toward the wreckage, his every movement filled with urgency. There was no hesitation, no mischief, only bravery. The screen flickered, showing him yanking the door open, pulling Judge Victoria Langley from the vehicle. He steadied her, urging her to move, before the SUV exploded in a fiery blast. Murmurs spread through the room. Some spectators shifted in their seats, exchanging stunned glances. Even the prosecution exchanged uncomfortable looks. There was no denying what they had just witnessed. Judge Langley's face turned red. Her hands gripped the edges of her bench, her composed expression cracking. She had built a reputation as a woman who was tough but fair. But today, she had been neither. Jamal stood tall, his hands still clenched at his sides. He had spent the last 24 hours fighting to be heard, and now the truth was playing out for everyone to see. Langley cleared her throat, straightened her shoulders, and spoke, her voice steady but softer than before. "The charges against Jamal Harris are dismissed." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Relief flickered across the faces of some, while others remained silent, grappling with what had just unfolded. Jamal's attorney nodded but said nothing. The video had done all the talking necessary. Judge Langley hesitated for a moment longer before speaking again. "This court stands adjourned." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, but its finality did not erase the weight of the moment. The woman who prided herself on fairness had judged without proof, and now she had been forced to face her own error. Jamal took a slow breath. He had fought for his dignity and won. But the damage had already been done. Do you believe apologies are enough when someone's dignity is on the line? Let's discuss. Hours later, Jamal Harris sat on the worn-out couch in his family's small apartment, replaying the day's events in his mind. The courtroom, the video, the moment Judge Langley finally acknowledged the truth. He should have felt victorious, but exhaustion weighed heavily on him. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Jamal's mother, Tanya, exchanged a wary glance with him before moving to open it. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, looking more uncomfortable than he had ever seen her, was Judge Victoria Langley. "Judge Langley," Tanya said, her voice laced with confusion. Langley nodded, shifting her weight as if uncertain about being there. "I was wrong," she admitted, her tone quieter than it had been in the courtroom. "And I owe your son more than an apology." Jamal, still seated, frowned slightly. He wasn't expecting this. Langley reached into her bag and pulled out a plain white envelope. She hesitated for a moment before handing it to Jamal. His fingers brushed against the paper, feeling its weight before he carefully opened it. Inside was a full scholarship to one of the best schools in the state. His mother gasped softly, one hand covering her mouth. Jamal's eyes scanned the letter, his heart hammering in his chest. "I didn't save you for a reward," he finally said, looking up at Langley, his voice steady. Langley exhaled, something shifting in her expression. For the first time, she looked at him not as a defendant, not as a suspect, but as an equal. "I know. That's why you deserve it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Tanya's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she placed a hand on her son's shoulder. Langley, still out of place in the small apartment, seemed to finally relax. Jamal looked down at the letter once more, the weight of it sinking in. He had fought so hard just to be heard. Now, for the first time, someone in power was truly listening. Do you think people can truly change? Share your thoughts. Jamal's courage forced a judge to rethink her own biases. He had stood alone in a courtroom demanding the truth be seen. He had fought against assumptions that could have destroyed him. And in the end, he had won, not just his freedom, but something much greater. His heroism didn't just save Langley's life. It changed the way she saw justice. For years, she had believed in the system she upheld, never questioning the fairness of her rulings. But when she looked at Jamal, she saw something she couldn't ignore. A boy who had done everything right and still ended up in handcuffs. And in return, Langley made a choice, to open doors instead of closing them. She had once been a judge who valued punishment over understanding. Now, she was someone who recognized the power of second chances. Jamal's story spread beyond the courtroom. It became a symbol of resilience, of the strength it takes to stand tall, even when the world tries to push you down. People across the city spoke his name. Teachers shared his story with students, and young boys who looked like him saw a glimpse of hope where there had once been fear. As days passed, Jamal adjusted to his new reality. The scholarship Langley had given him opened doors he had never imagined walking through. He attended a school where opportunity wasn't just a dream, but an expectation. Yet, he never forgot where he came from, or the fight it took to get there. He often thought about that night, the screeching tires, the fire, the fear. He thought about the way people looked at him when the police arrived, the way their assumptions nearly cost him everything. But he also thought about the change that had come from it, not just for himself, but for the people who would come after him. Langley, too, was changed. She carried Jamal's story with her into every courtroom, into every decision she made. She no longer saw justice as a rigid force, but as something that could bend when needed, something that could listen. She made sure that every ruling she delivered was based not just on evidence, but on understanding. Jamal's journey had rewritten the future, not just for him, but for others like him who might have faced the same fate. One brave act had changed everything. What's the biggest lesson from Jamal's journey? Let's talk in the comments.